I discovered And Also the Trees right about 1990. I was playing for a band whose guitarist had a girlfriend that had decided to move in with him, the guitarist. And this young lady had more vinyl LPs than anyone knew what to do with. So she asked me, Stephen, can you look after some of these vinyl LPs until I figure out what I'm going to do, as she was moving into this guy's very small apartment. She brought over crates and crates and crates full of LPs. Now, in those days, most of my time was spent either rehearsing with this band or chasing girls. And I found myself one Saturday night neither rehearsing for that band nor chasing girls. And I decided that I would dig through some of these crates of vinyl LPs and just see what she had in there. Now, as we were all very much into the goth scene at that time, of course, there was a lot of the goth standards, but I came across albums that she had in there by this band called And Also the Trees. And I had never heard of them at that time, but I found that the covers of the albums looked very intriguing. I remember Farewell to the Shade very well. The cover of the album was so cool and atmospheric. So I put these albums on and immediately fell in love with the sound. I remember listening to the first album, And Also the Trees, back to front, and absolutely fell in love and went one to the other. I remember, of course, Farewell to the Shade being in there, and the live album, The Evening of the 24th, and of course, one of my favorite albums to this very day, Virus Meadow. And that is how I found And Also the Trees, and still a huge fan as of now.
And Also the Trees I originally came to through the introduction of my drummer, Stevyn Grey, who had discovered them through a friend who we were helping move, and he found these albums in one of her crates and got to listening to them and played them for me, assuming that I would really enjoy them, because he had really taken to them and was completely smitten with them upon first listen. I, on the other hand, did not. I didn't enjoy them the first time I heard them, or for some time after. I actually used to tell them to turn them off because they used to bother me when I was first listening to them. And I recall distinctly actually saying, turn off this Elvis shit, because Simon's voice, for whatever reason at the time, didn't agree with me. However, being the bloody-minded individuals that we were, he continued playing them on repeat for some time. And he was determined to get me into And Also the Trees, which he very successfully did, largely by playing the first two albums quite regularly. And it was the first one specifically, So This Is Silence, which kind of brought me into the fold. With continued listening, I eventually came around and really started to like them. And then progressing our way through different titles, Virus Meadow was the next one that kind of really pulled me in, all the way through up to and including Farewell to the Shade, which at the time was a new album. And that was the introduction. That was what drew me in and got me started on this journey that we're all still on today.
My favorite And Also the Trees LP, very difficult to try to pin it down to one, of course. But I think it would probably be Virus Meadow. Why? Jeez. The production on the album, of course, is absolutely pristine. There was something about the atmosphere on that album that caught me at that time and really, truly spoke to me. I mean, you go from songs like Slow Pulse Boy, of course, the title track. I found myself listening to that album nonstop. Of course, there was a turntable back then, and as soon as one side would end, I would flip the album over and listen to it again. and again and again and again. And I'm sure that in that little apartment that I lived in, my neighbors became very, very tired of hearing And Also the Trees, or they became big fans. One or the other, I'm not exactly sure which. But yes, I would say Virus Meadow, really because of the atmosphere that album sets, and to this day, it hits me right here.
That's almost a Sophie's Choice kind of scenario, trying to come up with one that's incredibly difficult. Although, and this might be cheating, but I think I'd have to put it down to The Evening of the 24th, specifically because it's the amalgamation of all my favorite material at that time. A lot of the style had shifted. I think Justin's guitar tone had shifted and evolved between the first album and the recording of The Evening of the 24th. Things like Wallpaper Dying and A Room Lives in Lucy were, in my opinion, a little bit more fully realized in the live setting, and there was an additional aggression to it, all the way down to the vocal mic shorting out on So This Is Silence, so that by the time Simon comes back in, he's just really cutting loose and, you know, screaming the parts, and there's just this extra layer of aggression that you can just feel in the recording. There's a very visceral sense of the live experience of the band. That's probably the earlier album that I go back to the most frequently, is Evening of the 24th, for sure.
Well, I've got an interesting little story about that. It's a sad tale. So get your tissues or your hankies ready. I was playing in a band on my first European tour in about 1992. Towards the end of the tour, I ended up moving to Strasbourg, France, the very beautiful young lady, and stayed there for several months. Now, at that time, the bassist for that band and my best friend to this very day, Mr. William Faith, was living in a town called Bochum, Germany. Not incredibly far from Strasbourg, France, but far enough. We were digging through magazines one day, newspaper articles about shows that were coming up, and this young French lady that I was living with and I noticed that And Also the Trees were playing at a club in Bochum, a club called Zwischenfall. And this was a club that William and I had played at a couple of times by this point. And this young lady and I thought, oh my gosh, we're going to buy tickets for this and we're going to get on a train and we're going to go. Of course, as my luck would have it, there was a railway strike in France at that very, very time, on that very day. And of course, this was the first railway strike that had happened in France in, 10 years or something like that. So I missed out on my chance to see And Also the Trees right then and there, just several 100 kilometers away from where we were living. And that's my sad tale. Sorry to say.
I had the immense fortune of seeing them 3 times so far. The very first time, my drummer Stevyn and I had both found out that they were going to be playing at Zwischenfall in Bochum, where I was living at the time. He was living in France, and so this was going to be this sort of pilgrimage that we were going to make to finally get to see And Also the Trees. As at the time in the States, it was only in recent times that I found out that And Also the Trees had even toured in the US, where prior to that, they were very much sort of an insider tip. You had to know some people who knew some people to get the goods. It was almost like this black market kind of experience, getting into them in the States. But here we were in Germany, where they were a well-known band and toured regularly. And Green as the Sea had just come out not long previous. And so we were familiar with some of the material from that album, and we were really excited to finally get the opportunity to see them. And of course, on the day, France had one of its infamous transit strikes, and so the trains weren't running. And so Stevyn couldn't get to Bochum for the show. And that took a chunk out of me because, again, this was my brother who had turned me on to this band in the first place. So the experience was very incomplete. At the same time, I felt like it was on me to absorb the experience as fully as possible so that I could then recount it and convey it to him with as much vibrance and experience as I could muster. It was every bit as magical as I was hoping. We were there in the club. The band marched on out to the stage from the dressing room, single file. I remember this was the tail end of the band's sort of original era where Justin was still wearing spats and suspenders and pinstripe slacks, and Simon was wearing a beige trench coat and English riding boots and jodhpurs, and came on stage with a single flower up to his nose, inhaled deeply of it, placed it in a bottle, and turned around, and the band launched into A Room Lives in Lucy with just absolute controlled abandon. It was so impactful, so powerful. And they proceeded to go on and do one of the best live sets that I've encountered to this day. Indelible impression. Nothing I could ever forget if I tried. And they played all my favorite material and just knocked it out of the park. It was fantastic. And afterward, the band marched off the stage single file, and that was the end of it. And it was, in a word, sublime. And so when I next saw Stevyn, I think we spoke on the phone next, and absolutely bittersweet, but I did recount to him to the greatest extent possible exactly how amazing it was.
The fact that you got to see them that night at Zwischenfall in Bochum and I didn't, I don't even know why we're still friends, to be honest with you. I called him the next day and asked him, hey man, how was the show? Oh, it was the greatest show ever, man. You missed out. Nice guy.
The second time I got to see And Also the Trees was in Germany once again. 4 years later, in 1996, a band I was in was playing a festival, the Zillow Festival in Rüsselsheim, Germany, and Also the Trees were also on the bill. By this point, the Klaxon had already come out, and they might have already had the follow-up out, but very different look and feel to the band. It was still the original lineup, still Stephen Burrows and Nick Havas, but there was like brightly colored polyester shirts and a little bit more of the Cuban Spy music vibe that was coming to the fore in their sound, and they were still amazing. We got to chat briefly with Simon before the set, which was great. I remember being particularly taken by the fact that Simon appeared to be enjoying himself and communicated as much in the mic, just very subtle, but he just said, I'm quite enjoying this, during the middle of the set, and that caught my attention. But it was amazing, it was fantastic, and really enjoyed that. And then finally, in more recent years, I want to say this is maybe 2016, at Wave Gothic Treffen in Leipzig, got to see them again with the current lineup and doing a lot of the classic material. I was also playing in another band that year, and so I didn't get to see, they did the Brothers of the Trees project as well, which is just Simon and Justin, doing stripped down versions of a lot of the early material. I missed that, which is lamentable, regrettable. I did get to see the And Also the Trees set, and it was every bit as potent and amazing as I recalled from the very first time. So also by this point, the band had almost come full circle and just integrated everything that the band had encompassed over all those years into one cohesive whole. And it came across brilliantly. It was just fantastic. Absolutely blew my mind.
Again, this is like asking a kid what his favorite candy is in a candy store. Really tough to narrow it down to one because so many of them really speak to me. But if I had to narrow it down to one, I would probably go with Virus Meadow. Why? From the opening guitar sounds, it's set up for this sense of foreboding and this sense of deep feeling that goes straight to your gut. And as soon as the rest of the instrumentation comes in and Simon starts to sing at almost a whisper, it hits you right in the heart. And then when you think you've got a feel for where this is going to go, it hits you. Just like that. And the chorus comes in and you are not the same person after that. I certainly wasn't.
Again, that's such an unfair question. Very difficult to say. If I had to come down to one, it would most likely be Gone Like the Swallows. It's for a combination of reasons. It's probably the song that I really feel represents the band as fully as possible out of the early work. In particular, you have Justin doing that sort of mandolin style guitar, and Simon delivering what to my mind is one of the most amazing lyrics set to music ever. It is the most evocative stream of consciousness lyric I think I can come up with. It says so much and evokes such a powerful sense of longing and absolutely grounds you in the sense. You feel that you're there. And the imagery that he's pulling up throughout this narrative is just so powerful and so compelling that you just can't help but get drawn into it. And it seats so perfectly in the landscape that the music is creating. And it moves almost in an orchestral sense, the way it's like almost in this ebbs and flows and the swell and dips of the song itself. The lyric and the music just complement each other so amazingly that at the end of it, you can't walk away from that untouched. To this day, it's the one I probably will point someone to if they want to know who And Also the Trees is.
They were able to open me up to a different style of musical thinking, something that I was not necessarily accustomed to. I come from, as a drummer, a very, very punk rock and roll background. Of course, at that time, I was certainly playing for a lot of goth and death rock bands, but always in my backbone was punk rock. But when I first played And Also the Trees, I felt that soft, atmospheric sound that showed me that you can be so incredibly powerful and evocative with just some simply placed notes. And the lyrics, of course, are once you hear them delivered and once you read what Simon has written, they're for me they've been life-changing. They're lyrics that poetry sits with me to this day and has absolutely helped me to understand different things about myself. And musically, it changed me. It opened me up to a different style of playing. Certainly, Nick Havas, as a drummer, taught me that I do not need to always pound the drumsticks down into the drums to be able to get power out of it. You can play softly with emotion and still be able to get your point across just as strongly.
They're a band that we discovered very organically. And as mentioned before, my drummer Stevyn kept foisting them on me until I was pulled into the orbit of the band, and I've never come out. They are an insider tip. They are under-acknowledged in a lot of areas where they haven't had the benefit of a large promotional push or a label or publicist pushing them out there so that more people know about them. But in Europe, that's where I really got to experience more of them, where they're more widely acknowledged, where more people know them. But here in the States, they're still relatively unknown, which is criminal. And so I take every opportunity to try to push them out there to anyone who will listen, because they are a band that has been there and been the soundtrack to a lot of moments, a lot of emotional things that have happened, have had them as a backdrop, had them as a soundtrack. And to a large extent, because of the lyrical prowess of Simon and the sonic paintings that Justin creates, they've taught me a greater vocabulary of emotion in a big way that goes beyond music. It actually affects my very life and the way that I perceive things. And I think it was Simon who'd mentioned something about their cover of Lady Darbanville, that they did it because one of the reasons that drew them into that track was that it sort of read like a Thomas Hardy novel. But there's so much of their material that feels like a Thomas Hardy novel. You absolutely feel like you're walking through a Bronte novel, or there's very much this ache that underlies all of their work, and you feel it. And once you encounter it, you just can't let go.
I'm going to give you just a few lines, and you tell me, please, Who in the world writes like this outside of one person, Simon Hugh Jones? From the song The Street Organ. She sings like a bird that wakes up warm and thinks the winter is over.
I just can't name anybody else in the world that sounds like him. He has a completely unique and identifiable signature as a guitarist, from the sort of mandolin strumming, scrubbing and strumming style that you hear in things like Gone Like the Swallows, through to things like Slow Pulse Boy, and the dynamics of that song alone are unparalleled. There's no one else that does work like that.
And also a line from The Street Organ. And this is just so incredibly evocative. It puts you in a place where you can just imagine exactly what it is that Simon is talking about. And that line is, "The street organ's music is heard for the first time here, for the last time there, and not at all."
L'Unica Strada in particular is, again, it's almost an orchestral piece unto itself. The emotion that he can convey sonically is, I mean, again, there's really not a lot of other guitarists out there that can do that. And I know I've spent a substantial amount of time on my own trying to reverse engineer and try to mimic some of those things just for my own satisfaction, just to try to, pull it apart and get there on my own. And it's a massive challenge. It's very difficult. And so I'm always forever watching what he does, trying to replicate it. And it's virtually impossible. Again, there's just no one quite like him. And he belongs up there with the best of them. He has a signature that's uniquely identifiable. I can pick him out in 2 notes anywhere. And I don't think he gets half the credit he deserves for what he does.
And a line that still rolls around in my head to this very day, from the song Slow Pulse Boy. "I could live in the space between his heartbeats." Who writes like that? Who writes like that? It's only Simon.